There is a specific way your children look at you when they think you've become a burden. It's not a look of hate, it's a look of inventory. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one I bought with my first big commission as an architect, and watched my son and his wife walk through my house with a clipboard. They weren't checking on my health, they were checking the square footage. "It's for the best, Dad," my son said, not looking me in the eye. "This house is too big for a man who can't even remember where he put his keys." I didn't tell him I knew exactly where my keys were. I also didn't tell him that I designed this entire neighborhood 40 years ago. My son thinks he's moving me into a luxury suite. He doesn't realize he's actually moving himself into a legal nightmare, because he forgot that in a house of cards, the architect is the only one who knows which card to pull. My name is Arthur Bennett. 42 years ago, I stood in an empty field with a rolled blueprint under my arm and told a city council that this neighborhood would still be standing long after they retired. I was 38, stubborn, and very good at understanding where weight belongs. I designed every street curve here, every drainage slope, every load-bearing wall in the first 12 homes, including this one. The armchair I'm sitting in. I bought it with my first major commission check. I remember the fabric choice. I remember the smell of fresh varnish when this house was framed. I remember the exact depth of the foundation, 36 inches, reinforced after I insisted on stronger footings than the developer wanted to pay for. What I don't remember, apparently, is where I leave my keys. That's what my son believes. He stood in my living room this morning with a clipboard in his hand. His wife followed behind him, measuring tape sliding along the baseboards I once aligned myself. "It's for the best, Dad," he said gently. Too gently. "This place is too much for you now, too much." I watched them whisper near the bay window I positioned for optimal winter light. They weren't checking for dust. They were checking square footage. His wife scribbled something down. "For bedrooms," she murmured. "Market's still strong. Market." I didn't correct them when they mentioned my memory issues. I didn't point out that the stove had never been left on. I didn't mention that my keys were exactly where they always are, in the porcelain bowl by the entryway I designed specifically so nothing important would ever be misplaced. Instead, I watched. Because there is a specific way your children look at you when they think you've become a burden. It's not anger. It's calculation. They didn't bring out the brochure immediately. First came the sighs, long, patient sighs, followed by concerned glances exchanged over my head as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. The questions came next, carefully softened at the edges. "Dad, did you take your medication this morning?" my son asked. I told him yes. He waited a beat, then asked again about yesterday, watching not for my answer but for hesitation. When none came, his wife still made a note on her clipboard. It was almost impressive, the choreography of it. Concern layered over logistics. Compassion wrapped neatly around calculation. Only after that did the brochure appear. My son placed it on the coffee table as though he were presenting a gift. Gold lettering shimmered across a beige cover, smiling silver-haired couples strolling through manicured gardens. "Silver Pines Luxury Living," he said gently. "It's not a facility. It's a community. I flipped through glossy pages, fitness rooms, chef-prepared meals, discreet medical staff, scheduled social evenings. Every photograph looked carefully staged, sunlight falling at perfect angles. "And this house?" I asked. "We'd list it," he replied quickly. "While the market's strong." There it was again, market. Not memories. Not history. Market. He began explaining comparable sales and rising property values. His wife added that empty houses lose value over time. Empty. Then came the paperwork. "Just something to make things smoother," he said, sliding a document toward me. "Power of attorney." I didn't reach for it immediately. I noticed the signature line first. The type date beneath it. Interesting. Because on that particular day, the one they believed I wouldn't remember, I wasn't confused. I was in a boardroom across town, consulting on a renovation project. And I have never, in 40 years of architecture, signed anything without studying its foundation first. I let the silence stretch after he slid the document toward me. Silence makes people talk. Architects learn that early. When a contractor starts over-explaining, you know something isn't level. Dad, it's just precautionary, my son added. In case something happens, something. He didn't specify what that something was. Stroke. Dementia. Confusion. The quiet erosion of credibility. It's easier to move a man when you first convince him he's already unstable. I finally picked up the paper. The language was neat. Clinical. Efficient. It granted authority over financial decisions, property transactions, medical directives. Broad authority. Too broad for something described as just in case. My daughter-in-law leaned forward. We'd only use it if we had to, of course. I traced the edge of the page with my thumb, studying the formatting. I've reviewed thousands of contracts in my life. Development charters. Zoning agreements. Construction liability waivers. You start to see patterns, where clauses hide, where intentions sit between the lines. Who drafted this? I asked. A lawyer, my son replied quickly. A friend. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing information at a reduced speed. Let them believe it. Outside, through the bay window, I could see the curve of Alder Ridge Drive, a curve I personally softened after arguing it would slow traffic and reduce long-term accident liability. The city had resisted, I hadn't. Foundations matter. Angles matter. Oversights become fractures. You know, I said lightly, when we built this neighborhood, there was a clause in the master development agreement. My son blinked. What clause? I replied, folding the power of attorney neatly and placing it back on the table. Just one of those structural details most people forget. I met his eyes then. In a house of cards, son, the architect is the only one who knows which card holds the weight. And for the first time that afternoon, he wasn't looking at me like inventory. He was looking at me like risk. My son tried to recover quickly. He always does. Confidence has been his preferred building material since college, light, polished, and not always load-bearing. What clause are you talking about, Dad? He asked, forcing a small laugh. This isn't one of your zoning stories again, is it? I leaned back into my armchair, the one purchased with my first serious commission, and looked past him, out toward the street I had once mapped with measuring tape and stubborn optimism. When we developed this subdivision, I said calmly, the city didn't want uniform design control after resale. They wanted flexibility. I disagreed. My daughter-in-law shifted. What does that have to do with this house? Everything, I replied. I stood slowly, not because I needed help, but because deliberate movement unsettles people who expect fragility. From the bookshelf near the fireplace, I pulled down a slim, weathered binder. Blue cover. Faded tab. Original development charter. I placed it on the table between us. In order to protect structural integrity and long-term value, I continued, I retained architectural oversight rights on the first 12 properties built under my supervision. My son frowned. Oversight rights, approval authority on major structural changes, I clarified. Including alterations, demolitions, and ownership transfers under certain conditions. Silence. My daughter-in-law shook her head slightly. That can't still apply. That was 40 years ago. Covenants run with the land, I said evenly. Not the owner. My son opened the binder, flipping pages faster than comprehension allowed. I watched his confidence shift, not vanish, but redistribute. Recalculate. There's no way this affects a simple sale, he muttered. Not a simple one, I agreed. He looked up. However, I added, there is a specific provision triggered if the primary architect's competency is formally challenged in connection to a property transfer. The room went very still. And what does that provision do? He asked carefully. I met his eyes without blinking. It freezes discretionary transfers pending independent review. His gaze flickered to the power of attorney still sitting on the coffee table. And for the first time since he walked in with that clipboard, he realized this house was not a retirement plan. It was a structure. And I had designed the load-bearing walls. They didn't leave right away. People rarely do when the ground beneath them starts to feel uncertain. Instead, my son suggested we talk it through like a family, as if this entire visit hadn't been carefully rehearsed. He poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen sink I had positioned beneath a reinforced beam, then returned to the table with a calmer tone and straighter posture. "Dad," he said, "no one is questioning your contributions. We're just trying to plan responsibly, responsibly. Another word that sounds solid until you test its footing." My daughter-in-law slid the power of attorney document closer to me again, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table. "This doesn't take anything away from you," she said. "It just lets us help. Help, I've learned, is often a synonym for control." I looked at both of them, really looked. Not as my children, but as people negotiating an asset they believed was already theirs. The whispering had stopped. The measuring tape lay coiled and forgotten. Now they were waiting for my compliance. "I'll need time," I said finally. My son exhaled, relief flashing too quickly across his face. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stood, straightening his jacket. "We'll come back tomorrow." Tomorrow? They gathered their things and headed for the door, confident again, their steps lighter than when they arrived. My son paused at the threshold. "Try not to worry, Dad," he said. "We've got everything handled." After they left, the house settled into its familiar quiet, the soft creak of framing, the subtle hum of a structure at rest. I remained in my chair for a long moment, listening. Then I reached for the phone. Some foundations are tested by pressure. Others reveal their strength when someone tries to move them. I didn't call the attorney I had used for decades immediately. I let the house breathe, let the afternoon sun hit the bay window just right, and let my son's words linger in the air. Then I picked up the phone. A few rings later, the familiar voice answered, calm and precise as always. "I need a review of the power of attorney I signed for my own property 40 years ago," I said. "And cross-check it against the original development covenant." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Arthur, you never stop, do you?" "I prefer certainty to assumptions," I replied. Within the hour, I had confirmation. The POA date my son believed was valid, invalid. Signed under incorrect circumstances. My authority as the original architect and as a formally recognized power of attorney holder was fully intact. The property could not be sold, mortgaged, or otherwise transferred without my explicit approval, and any attempt to bypass that clause would trigger a formal audit and automatic hold on all accounts tied to the house. I let the documents rest on the table, then walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood I had mapped decades ago remained quiet, orderly, unaware that the very house they had assumed was theirs was now shielded by a clause they had never read. When my son returned the next morning, confident as always, I met him in the living room. His clipboard was back in his hand, but this time, his steps were careful. "Dad, what did the attorney say?" he asked, attempting a casual tone. I smiled slowly, setting my coffee down. "Funny you should ask. It turns out that the moment you questioned my competence, you activated the one clause that gives me final say over this house." His eyes widened. He wasn't looking at me like a father anymore. He was measuring risk. The room went still. My son stared at me, realizing too late that the house he thought he could list at a premium was now effectively untouchable without my approval. His wife looked equally shocked, clutching her clipboard like it might shield her from the consequences. I walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the original master blueprint for the subdivision, and laid it flat on the coffee table. Its edges were worn, the paper faintly yellowed, but the lines were as precise as the day I drew them. "Every curve, every grade, every structural detail," I said, tracing a finger along one of the streets, "was designed to last. And to protect my properties, including this one, in ways most people forget to read." My son swallowed. "So, what now?" he asked cautiously. I folded my hands on the blueprint. "Now, we talk about respect. About understanding that this house isn't just walls and floors. It's every decision, every precaution I put into it. You're welcome to visit, to care, to live here, but any change, any transaction, must go through me." The silence stretched. The weight of 40 years of work, oversight, and careful documentation pressed down on the room. Finally, he nodded slowly. Hesitantly. Not because he agreed entirely, but because he knew arguing further would be pointless. I leaned back into my armchair, the one I bought with my first big commission, and allowed a small, satisfied smile. The house, The legacy and the authority all remained intact. They had thought I was forgetting everything. But I had remembered the one thing that mattered most. And in a house of cards, the architect is always the one who knows which card to pull.